Sometimes, the hardest thing to do when creating a sequel to a story you've done is trying to figure out how to connect it to the original. Do you go and make it a few years later with a new antagonist for the characters to deal with? Should the themes and ideas you covered in the original story be the same, or is something new required? There is often no right or wrong answer to what should be done. In the case of Jojo's Bizarre Adventure, though, it continues in ways you wouldn't expect as we go into my personal favorite part of the series, Battle Tendency. Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am your ever-friendly Pokeprof, and welcome back to Fascinating Fiction's theme month, Jojo June, where we're going to be spending the entire month of June talking about the amazing, crazy, over-the-top, and otherwise generally cool series, Jojo's Bizarre Adventure. Hopefully I did a little bit more justice in describing it this time. This time around, we're talking about the direct sequel to Jonathan's original story, and the point where I knew I'd be watching the rest of the series regardless of how it turned out, for better or for ill. So what is it about this particular series that resonated so much with me compared to its predecessor? Well, let's talk about it a bit and find out. One of the first things we really gotta focus on when it comes to talking about Battle Tendency is actually something that becomes a running constant considering Araki's work within JoJo. That is to say, what carries on between the different series. Oftentimes, whenever you get a sequel series for any franchise, it's usually just the characters that are carried beyond, with many of the story elements, items, and sometimes entire plot lines just left to rot in the previous incarnations for whatever reason. Think of things like the Ark of the Covenant from Indiana Jones. It's a powerful item with such a possible history about it that you could likely continue making movies focused on just that alone. And yet it's completely ignored in favor for other treasures throughout the rest of the series. Araki, on the other hand, decided to use a previously established item to actually carry on the story. In this case, the stone mask from the original JoJo that turned Dio into his vampiric form. Except this time, we're going a bit more into the history of the mask that kinda got left out of the original anime adaptation, though it apparently is still there in the manga. That is, the creation of the original vampires. But we'll get to that in a little bit, since instead we're going to be focusing on the actual main character of Battle Tendency, Joseph Joestar, grandson to Jonathan Joestar, and the start of a rather bizarre family tree. This is actually an interesting way to handle a sequel series since, in most cases, a lot of creators will tend to keep the same characters, knowing that fans would want to stick with them as long as possible. Araki decided against that and also made our new character quite different from his grandfather. While Jojo Prime prided himself on being a gentleman first and foremost, eventually learning about Hamon later on in the story to help fight off against Dio, Jojo 2.0 here is actually very quite different. Unlike his grandfather, he's got access to Hamon naturally, almost as if by instinct. Their personalities also couldn't be any more different, as Joseph is confrontational and has little respect for most people in positions of power, especially if they abuse said position for their own gain. He's one of those characters that could be rude and abrasive to a lot of folks, but because of his values and how he treats his friends and family, it shows just what kind of person he is and makes him worthy of being the hero of the story. Battle Tendency actually starts out with one of the characters from Phantom Blood, known as Strazo, using the stone mask to gift himself with the powers of a vampire, before going over to New York to take out our current JoJo. The only reason he actually does this is because he's wanting to kill the only people that would know about the mask and ways to stop him. In other words, Joseph himself and his grandmother, Irina. I'll actually say straight up that this is one of the few problem points I've got with the story, and is a bit of a running thing I've noticed when it comes to Araki's work so far within JoJo. You see, Straizo is actually a good guy in Phantom Blood, working alongside Jonathan and the others to take down Dio by the end of the original story. He wasn't a major character, but he was still a good guy all the same. Araki decided that, to tell the story he wished to tell, he had to change this character, to alter them and shift them to fit their needs. And this won't be the only time he does it either, where some major aspect of the story or a character is changed because he wants things a certain way. While none of these particular changes ruin any of JoJo for me in particular, it is something that I've noticed, and in the case of one very specific character change, kind of aggravated me. We'll get to that when we get to that. Regardless, after defeating Straizo, Joseph here goes on his main adventure, eventually coming up against the major villains of this particular JoJo arc, the Pillar Man, 3 vampires from ancient times known as AC/DC, Wamu, and Cars, who I honestly don't think I really need to go over just what musical references those 3 are. Cars is actually the biggest one of the bunch, not only being the man who created the stone mask, but the one with the biggest goals. Not only was the mask designed to make more of his kind, but it was also there to enhance their powers, to make them more than just vampires, and to evolve them into the ultimate life forms. The only way to do that is to get another artifact introduced into this series, the Red Stone of Aja, and combine it with the stone mask. With that knowledge, JoJo seeks out the stone in a way to stop the rise of the Pillar Man. Along the way, he meets up with characters like Caesar Zappelli, the grandson of Will Zappelli from the original story, Lisa, a master of Hamon technique who teaches them, and Stroheim, a soldier in the late 1930s from Europe. Yeah, I'm not touching that one anymore. Now, if we're talking about terms of story quality, the actual major events of things are very much improved from Phantom Blood. Not only is everything told over a longer period of time, 18 episodes compared to the original 9 of the anime, for example, it actually also gives the characters time to breathe, develop, and even grow over the course of everything. We get interesting character elements, such as Jojo's ability to use his wits to predict the next thing his opponent's gonna say before they say it and surprising them in battle, all the way to Caesar having the most deadliest use of bubbles in an anime, or manga for that matter, since Sailor Mercury. The training feels more like proper training for the characters to go through, having to use Hamon to climb up an oiled pillar instead of just holding a glass of wine without spilling it. And we get some honestly rather interesting fights and surprises throughout the series, with even one of the Pillar Men actually being somewhat honorable in his fight with Jojo at the end. This series feels like a natural progression for Phantom Blood in pretty much every way, with all the aspects that made the original so well loved being cranked up to 11. I mean, look at some of the poses here for the Pillar Man. They just ooze confidence on our villain's part, and while they can be a little bit silly at times, it's just a big part of the JoJo series. The fights themselves also feel a bit more natural, with the fact that the fighters, while still having the occasional weird ability, aren't pulling things out of nowhere like we saw occasionally in Phantom Blood. Now, surprisingly, despite how much better Battle Tendency is than its predecessor, it's actually not the most popular story of this bizarre adventure. That honor goes to the next series in JoJo, the 3rd part in this ongoing franchise, and the one that changes the battlefield completely from this point onward. So, folks, prepare yourself for the most well-known of all the JoJos, as well as one of the longest-running series in the entire franchise. Stardust Crusaders.